This is Luke Huntley, and the project I'm working on is how to teach diversity in the classroom. Not so much of the content you give students, but the way in which you approach diversity in the classroom. And it's a concept I like to call, well, it's in my notes here. Let me look at my notes. This is called being unprepared. Yes, okay, it is called teaching diversity in the classroom. Well, that's kind of self-explanatory, but regardless. Now, the main thing I want to approach here is to look at the lost generation authors during the literary modernism era. Now, what you have is, we're going to break it up into three sections here, talking about how things were different in the lost generation era with those authors as opposed to the Victorian era. Like, what was the Victorian era, and how is it different in the 1920s and 30s when these authors and poets were going on? What is the Harlem Renaissance movement, and how did these authors and poets differ from the Lost Generation? Even though they're in the same time period, you can see that because it's a different ethnicity, it's a different perspective on the culture of America. And finally, I want to talk about how you can use this method to teach diversity within the classroom, looking at different ethnicities and different viewpoints. Because, like I said, although these two movements coincided in the same time period, they were drastically differently on how they viewed things. So what we have in the Victorian era, it was a period named after Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. And it was based on traditional values and honor and this whole idea of the American dream, where you can start out as whoever or whomever and, own your own business and, get a whole bunch of money and whatnot. It's traditional. It's sacred. So what you had after the Great War, or World War I as it's called now, is a disconnect with a lot of young people, the lost generation. That was a term coined by Ernest Hemingway. And here's a few notable authors in that time period. And themes that coincide with this lost generation era mainly talk about the death of the American dream and bringing up social inequality and wealth inequality. And those where you got things like the Industrial Revolution was going on, so you see a big rise in corporate America. So it was hard for someone just to come up and be somebody. It was the big corporations taking over things. And it became more of, you saw a lot of wealth inequality more than you did prior to the Victorian era. So a lot of the people in this lost generation wrote themes about despair and things like that. Now what you have with the Harlem Renaissance is a movement with African American poets and authors, and they didn't really see this era as being downtrodden and all this disparity, because what you have to remember is they were already experiencing that even during the Victorian era with the Civil War and Reconstruction and things like that. However, when they were going to France and things like that during the Great War, they were in a position where segregation wasn't really an issue anymore. So they have these new ideas of independent freedom and prosperity that they didn't necessarily get at home. So when they return to the States, they have these new notions of, I can do things now, I have hope, and I have intellectual freedom. And this was, I believe, the seeds to the civil rights era that you had in the 50s. So as opposed to the lost generation, the Harlem Renaissance was a movement of optimism and hope, and they did write about how it was hard for them in their ethnicity groups. But you had certain authors, I believe like Zora Hurston, who wrote that even though I'm in this bad situation, I have hope. And you didn't really see a lot of that in the lost generation movement. So how can we use this as an example to teach diversity in the classroom? Well, when you have a diverse class, a mixture of African Americans or Hispanics and white people, I think one of the big mistakes that a teacher would make is they would say, okay, well, I'm going to teach some Langston Hughes to appease the African Americans, and then some Walt Whitman to appease the white students, and maybe, if I'm bold enough, maybe some Don Quixote for the Hispanics. although that's okay, what you're really giving them is just content. You're not tying everything together. You're still separating them by just giving them content that would appease to them and their culture. And I believe, although people in different ethnicities cannot 100% understand someone's issues or someone's problems, it goes back to the idea I pointed out earlier, is you can be unified by diversity. So if you can find this common thread of, although we are different for different reasons, we are the same because we are different. So if you just apply that concept and try and tie things together, as opposed to giving students just content information, then I believe that could be something you might want to try doing. Well, anywho, that is my project. I have completely forgotten what this project is supposed to be called, and it is 3 days late, but we're going to do what we're going to do. Thank you very much.